Thanks to CPE and the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation and Transform and whoever else put energy and effort into organizing this event and bringing us here to discuss how to get to a more utopian kind of city. Thank you all for bringing us here. I'm really happy to be in Belgrade for the first time in my life. I have heard a lot about your valiant struggles against the waterfront development, especially thanks to one member of the audience who was in Athens, among others, to teach us about this important struggle. But besides that, I actually know very little about urban social movements in Eastern and Central European cities. I do know enough that it's rather different from the so-called developed capitalist countries. And so, you know, I never know why people invite me to places where I really cannot, you know, I know nothing, but it may have to do with the fact that capitalism, or especially the latest neoliberal version of it that has been let loose across the world, has created very similar dynamics and similar patterns and similar problems across very different political cultures, very different cities. And so maybe some of what I have learned in the course of the years that I have been working with and about the challenges of urban social movements, maybe some of this can be useful for political practice here as well. Let's hope. So let's hope I'll be brief enough to have lots of time for discussion. I can also stop at any point. We can just discuss, because I never know how long my notes will last. So, urban scholars, left-leaning urban scholars, I should say, have been of rather different minds in their assessment of the transformative potentials of urban social movements. You all are probably familiar with David Harvey's rather positive assessment. He deems cities and the struggles over the right to the city as central for the revolutionary transformation. Whereas others, such as Andy Merrifield, who has been most vocal maybe in this field, particularly after experiencing the Occupy Wall Street movements, not just in the US, but other places, as you know, he considers the right to the city as unsuitable for today's struggles, as simply not the right that needs articulating. Yet others, also in the wake of Occupy and especially the Indignado and other movements that relied so heavily on assemblies, which then, when they would be evicted from the central squares of cities, would seep into neighborhoods and have assemblies and direct democratic practices, deliberative practices, but also increasingly alternative forms of organizing services there. They would also emphasize the transformative, in the sense of real democratic potential of cities and of struggles within and over cities. But of all of these, I would like to dwell on David Harvey's position for a little bit as a way of getting our thinking going, because I think his effort is worth putting our head around. You probably know that in his early work, he didn't think that way at all. 2001, he still was talking about the local trap that would mislead us. He was concerned that urban movements would remain wedded to local and always very particular issues without the potential of going beyond that. But in his later analyses of urban change in the context of global political economic transformations, he identifies in these transformations, i.e. in global urbanization, the cause for a new wave of urban movements. So in this book that you probably saw, Rebel Cities, which collected some of the writings he had done in the course of the 10 years or so preceding its publication, he explicitly deals with the significance of the urban for the contemporary and impending social transformations, and he asks who the potential agents of this transformation might be, and his answer to this question was the urban producers, those who produce the urban. That's from construction workers to public employees to hospital workers, a lot of different groups who produce the city, which as yet, unfortunately, is not yet organized, and it is hardly recognized as that agent, but at least potentially he sees it that way. So he argues that cities are more than mere passive sites, mere places of appearance of new movements, and he gives 3 reasons for this. The first has to do with the specific urban characteristics that imply simply that cities are more conducive to protests and struggles than other terrains, because elements of the built environment and political functions make them into central sites of political action and of revolt, as the example he points to would be Tahrir Square, or the in Cairo, or Puerta del Sol for the Arab Spring, Puerta del Sol for the Indignado movement, Cairo for the Arab Spring. And the second reason he gives is the fact that political protests are often capable of disrupting urban economies. The massive protests in the US in 2006 by immigrant communities against a proposal that was then before Congress to criminalize undocumented migrants amounted, in fact, to a strike that effectively closed down a lot of economic activity in cities such as Los Angeles and Chicago that depend very heavily on undocumented migrant labor, and also demonstrated the vulnerability of such cities to such unpredictable action for today's urban centers. And finally, a third reason he gives is that cities, city regions, have become central hubs for the production and reproduction of global capitalism, and therefore have gained in significance because politics, a lot of politics has become rescaled to this local level. And so, by implication, this means even if movements target only the urban, they automatically, under these current conditions, articulate larger systemic contradictions because city regions have taken on these significant roles. Okay, these 3 reasons give him cause to ask whether, beyond the visible evidence of the relevance of urban struggles, there is, now I quote him, something about the urban process and the urban experience, the qualities of daily urban life under capitalism, that in itself has the potential to ground anti-capitalist struggles. He's implying, of course, that yes, there is. He concludes that struggles within and over the city and over the qualities and prospects of urban living should be seen as fundamental to anti-capitalist politics. And the most capable and most likely agent, I already alluded to this, struggle for and to achieve an alternative to neoliberal capitalism, the only one that today can connect and achieve both localized worker control and global coordinations, in his view, would be those urban social movements, which he sees as made up of a redefined working class, encompassing all those who produce and reproduce urban life, and who are not so much exploited through the classic industrial labor process, but dispossessed by merchants, landlords, financiers. It's also a form of exploitation. So central for his argument are two moves. One, that he redefines the class concept underlying the traditional working class, as well as the terrain of class struggle, because so-called secondary forms of exploitation via dispossession have increased through what we now have come to call accumulation by dispossession, and because he sees the producers of the urban as also creating value as well as surplus value, so they too experience exploitation, if not in the industrial labor process, but through being dispossessed by finance, real estate, merchant capital. And the second move, because of the importance of the highly developed international division of labor that now characterizes capitalism, there is a need to create institutions of global coordination. Therefore, he rejects traditional leftist theorists who see urban social movements as separate from and merely ancillary to anti-capitalist or class struggles that are based in the exploitation and alienation of the production process. He writes, anti-capitalist struggle must not only be about reorganizing within the labor process, fundamental though that is, but must also be about finding a political and social alternative to the operation of the capitalist law of value across the world market. And the traditional left theorists, in his view, underestimate the potential power of the urban workers, even if today they are still precarious and still fragmented. But organized, those workers would have the power to strangle the metabolism of the city, quote David Harvey. Okay, I won't go into Merrifield so much as maybe just a sentence. He questions, obviously, Harvey's suggestion that the city plays a key role in the struggles against neoliberalism, because he writes the specificity of the city seems to be that there is no longer any specificity, because we have now planetary urbanization, and so the whole world is urbanized, so what's so special about the urban, right? So therefore we should not bother with developing the right to the city. That's just not where it's all about. The other observers that I alluded to in the very introductions, mostly political scientists coming from Hannah Arendt, other earlier authors, they read these movements like Occupy and Indignados more than urban movements that have sprung up in the context of 2011 and following, as having a specifically urban transformative potential, because it has been in their context that the asambleas and the neighborhood councils have emerged across especially Spanish and Greek, but also other cities where people no longer confront the consequences of the crisis as atomized individuals, but as community that is also, at least sporadically, connected across countries, internationally. Okay, none of these, this was sort of like a little literature review in academic jargon, and interesting as I find these views on the role that urban social movements may play, I don't think any of them tell us anything about the conditions of success of urban social movements, the conditions under which their transformative potential may actually be realized. Success of protest movements is something that's difficult to measure by any account. You always have some projects that boost emancipatory efforts while failing in terms of power, politics, and on the other hand, you have movements that have long ago failed in terms of emancipatory criteria, but continue with powerful leverage over quite some time. So I find a line of Boaventura de Souza quite helpful, who reminds us that collective transformative action always begins on the terrain and within the constraints set by the oppressor. Not very much different from the work by Marx that Bhaskar cited earlier. And that success of the collective action has to be measured by the movement's capacity to transform, in the course of their struggle, the terrain and the constraints of the conflict. I take this to mean that remaking the city and regions and societies is always simultaneously a struggle over power. Now, in the neoliberal city, the struggle over power has taken on a very different form and quality than in the previous Keynesian Fordist city, which was more state-based, centralized, top-down, and quite antagonistic to any form of insurgent citizen action outside of the large tripartite corporatist arrangements. Today, under conditions of the neoliberal city, power is much more fragmented. Many civil society networks have been roped into state policies, while in fact many more groups have become more disempowered, more dispossessed. So a much more fragmented landscape of movements. Whether an urban social movement can be successful in this context hinges on the very specific contemporary conditions, and for that I think we need to qualify success more specifically in terms of the way that neoliberal urban developments can be effectively challenged. So defining movement success would require that we identify the constraints set up by the dynamics of the neoliberal city, that we need to understand what matters to neoliberal urbanism and its reproduction and its vulnerabilities. So for those three things, I suggest we take a closer look at neoliberal urbanism. I've published some stuff about that, so you can read up about the features of neoliberal urbanism, which in my mind are setting the parameters for the struggles of urban social movements and against what they have to measure their success. So, since neoliberalism looms so largely, I had wanted to have a little excursus here about whether we even are still in neoliberalism, which a lot of people are questioning since globalization doesn't, or free markets don't seem to exist in the same way anymore, as many have come to associate essential for neoliberalism. But we will talk about this tomorrow when Leo gives a talk, so I can throw this bracket out. Let me just say it's still neoliberalism, even if a more authoritarian version that we are about to witness. So I think my 4 features of neoliberal urbanism still hold. And they are growth first, or, I mean, neoliberalism has been with us for 4 decades now, and so this imperative of growth first has gone through some transformations, and growth is being chased in rather new ways now in its most recent round of neoliberalizing cities and regions. Secondly, entrepreneurial forms of governance. I'm talking particularly about city governance. Thirdly, privatization, again on the municipal level. And fourth, the way to deal with polarization within cities with socio-spatial polarization has also changed in some profound ways. And these 4 features are really affecting the ways in which urban movements can act, and they have been affecting the ways in which the movements themselves have changed. So let me try to rush through these speedily. Chasing growth in new ways. As I already said, it's growth first has been with us since the beginning of the neoliberal turn. It had meant that urban managers do whatever they can to accelerate investment flows into the city and to improve their position within the interurban rivalry. So cities that come out on top of this now increasingly global competition include those whose real estate markets appear as safe havens to footloose global capital, such as London, New York, Vancouver, Shanghai, or cities whose credit-fueled construction boom, as in Istanbul, or whose tourism industry, as in Barcelona, have driven real estate surges. Even aspiring cities of the global south, in their efforts to reach world-class status, have joined this competition with enormous speed, and since growth is not as sluggish in some of these regions, often with significant success. Obviously, not all cities can come out on top, so this interurban competition has led urban policymakers and planners everywhere to prioritize, unless challenged by mass movements, highest and best use as criteria for land use decisions, to roll forward gentrification, to create urban enclaves, privatized spaces of elite consumption, and sanitized spaces of social reproduction, thereby transforming the built environment. An effect of the pursuit of such growth-chasing projects, heated by international property speculation, have of course been exploding property prices, which in turn have led to surges of evictions, social displacement, and a new homeless crisis born out of an affordable housing crisis, in addition to that born out of the subprime mortgage crisis as in Spain. So we also have a growing number of cash-strapped cities who cannot engage on that top level in these forms of interurban rivalry, so they will rely more on low-cost, more symbolic ways to play up the local flavor and to attract creative classes that might help culturally upgrade their brand. That is to say, the search is on for innovative, low-budget, especially culture-led efforts to mobilize city space for growth. There exists, of course, a great variety of cultural branding strategies. I won't go into this, but the important point here is that in this process, artists and creative workers, including precarious creative workers, that means including many of you, have an important role to play. Because in the urban development strategies, you can play an important role to enhance the unique brand of your city. At least in many cities, the politicians have discovered this usefulness. Even oppositional movements, even the squatters in Berlin, who, with their beautification of the walls of houses, their graffiti, have been discovered as attracting tourists from around the world, and so today Berlin is the hippest city, attracting people from everywhere. So this is a form of cultural capital, at least it has been made in that. So even radical squats or self-managed social centers are seen as charging their environment with cultural capital, which in the scheme of creative city politics then becomes transformed by investors into economic capital, and that plays off. Second, entrepreneurial governance. In ever more policy areas, there's hardly one left where marketized and or entrepreneurial forms have not been introduced, presumably because business models and privatized forms of governance are more efficient. So municipalities have thoroughly internalized the entrepreneurial logics of public-private partnerships, outsourcing of risks, speculative investment, aided along the way by disseminators of policy intelligence such as the World Bank, the IMF, the World Trade Organization, the OECD. Strategies such as outcontracting and task and project-driven initiatives such as developing a particular part of town, upscale uses for waterfronts, science cities, and other such projects suggested by the growth first imperatives such as competing for mega events such as Olympics or World Cups, international building exhibits. These kinds of projects have everywhere become routinized maneuvers in governance. And where funding streams from superior levels of government have dried and local governments need to do more with less, cities have increasingly turned to markets, and not just for funding speculative projects, but even to fund basic infrastructure. In this process, of course, what happens is that urban governance structures are becoming financialized. So in contrast to the previous Keynesian mode of governance, which generally used to secure the consent of the governed through tripartistic, corporate, and more long-term designs, these novel modes of governance, while less transparent and often not democratically legitimated, produce hegemony if they produce it, and to some extent they do succeed in producing it by making very flexible, small, and constantly changing concessions to different groups, mostly middle class based and upwardly mobile groups. This trend towards projects has transformed municipal planning, where informal and cooperative procedures have now gained a new significance. In this increasingly ad hoc and informalized political process, out-of-town investors, global developers, and corporate flippers have come to play ever stronger roles. These entrepreneurial governance strategies and their lack of public transparency and their strengthening the hand of outside investors have of course given rise to all kinds of struggles over representative democracy, or rather the erosion of it, and over the exclusion of what has become expendable groups from the city. So in a way, the real democracy demands of the indignados, as well as the resistance against plans for Istanbul's Gezi Park or the Yellow Duck protests here, countless urban campaigns against the undemocratic ways in which large urban infrastructure projects would get pushed through. All these struggles have contested the underlying shift towards entrepreneurial urban governance. Third, privatization. What am I here in Eastern Europe telling you about privatization? I think maybe we can skip this part for reasons of... let me just say a little bit then about this updated toolkit for dealing with social polarization. Obviously, such polarization has been intensifying ever since the onset of neoliberal urbanism, and this meant that the numbers of vulnerable groups, as well as the number of their grievances, have been exploding due to deregulation and flexibilization of labor markets, welfare retrenchment, increase of low wage and of informal sectors that employ growing sections of the precariat and growing numbers of migrants, and also differentiating, more and more differentiating precarious, often paperless workers. In order to address the territorial concentration of what became termed social exclusion, a toolkit was invented during the last rollout phase of neoliberalization that consisted primarily of area-based programs. So they would be made up of a mix of neighborhood revitalization and activation programs that were to stop the presumed downward spiral of these blighted neighborhoods. These programs in Germany and all the other Central European countries have meanwhile been severely curtailed, slashed, and superseded by a new two-pronged policy. Its prongs are, on the one hand, attrition and displacement policies, and on the other, a more benign program designed to incorporate select impoverished populations and areas into upgrading efforts. This benign prong frequently gets applied to decaying social housing districts or ex-industrial areas, which now, due to changing circumstances, are deemed to have some development potential. However, the prong that under conditions of austerity urbanism is used far more widely and consists of repressive and criminalizing measures and instruments. It entails punitive strategies that tend to criminalize unwanted behaviors and groups, as well as attrition and displacement policies that evict and banish the poor, pushing them to further outskirts or into invisible interstices of blight within the urban perimeters. So many communities of color, informal workers, homeless people, the undocumented, and increasingly the new austerity victims, as well as protest movements and urban rioters, are primarily exposed to this repressive side of neoliberal politics. Stricter laws, tougher policing, more disenfranchisement. So because these two prongs have very different ambiguous effects on urban social movements, the first prong makes it difficult to organize the working class in an area where they hope to benefit from the upgrading. Has created a lot of struggles in cities such as Hamburg and made it really difficult for the right to the city movement there. And the repressive prong, for obvious reasons, shrinks the room to maneuver for oppositional groups, their resources, and so on and so forth. So, in sum, neoliberal urbanism has redefined the ground for urban movements. They confront additional targets and adversaries beyond city politicians, such as unelected technocrats, especially financial technocrats, as well as global investors and developers who are behind the financialization of property and housing markets, and pushing, of course, for big development projects. Some of these actors who are responsible for what the locals perceive as problematic developments are very difficult to target, unlike the local growth machines and business-dominated regimes that movements would attack in the past. The banking institutions responsible today are increasingly headquartered in other countries. Well, maybe you should go to Saudi Arabia or Qatar. For another, movements now mobilize around a panoply of new issues, such as privatization and cuts to education, childcare, social services, and pensions, evictions, rising poverty and homelessness, as well as racist, anti-refugee populism, and the media campaigns against various others. So all different kinds of issues have come onto the agenda of these urban movements. And in addition, we witness de-democratization processes in various spheres, suspension of civil rights, which increasingly affect the movement's own practices. And we face more and more new forms of repression. We lose state funding or legal status as recognized associations, or public support because some of the movement groups get criminalized and thereby suffer from shrinking resources, opportunities, and open spaces for activities. On the other hand, the movement terrain has been altered because it has expanded, because all these new actors who mobilize around these restrictive measures and who scandalize the deprivation of rights and resources have joined us. So human rights groups and solidarity initiatives and refugee support groups, that's all new energy that has entered the field of urban social movements, always posing both an opportunity and a challenge because they have to become socialized into activism. It's not, doesn't come automatically. So what appears, on the one hand, a huge achievement when compared to earlier waves of urban movements, that more different groups from across the social spectrum are now involved in movements for a more just city, presents, on the other hand, unfamiliar and tough challenges because the heterogeneity of backgrounds, socializations, and interests creates tensions and frictions for collaborating. While neoliberal urbanism has produced a growing and differentiated spectrum of discredited groups, groups that don't have any credit, which you need to have in neoliberalism, these do not, in spite of their shared expulsion or disenfranchisement, automatically share positionalities and interests. So we are confronted with situations where these different interests and positionalities clash. And in my view, that is a good thing because it provides us an opportunity to get to know each other and to develop forms of learning to respect these differences and find ways of developing joint struggles. I think it's a crucial first step, not only for socializing the non-traditional activists into movement building, but also for seasoned political activists to reconfigure their assumptions about how to build and grow movements adequate to the historical situation. So on the basis of this first on-the-ground step, varied localized joint struggles will need to multiply beyond the sum of their parts. Because as localized struggles, they are no match for the systemic forces that have been animating the meta-politics of austerity. There will be no real chance to break with the pattern of neoliberal austerity until such localized struggles begin to multiply beyond the sum of their parts. And we build new forms of inter-urban politics and join forces across the uneven urban landscapes, the uneven regions of Europe, and beyond. This will require that the dispersed sites of protest forge a broader and inter-urban anti-neoliberal front, and that their networking across local alternatives become more effectively articulated with a strategic fight for a post-neoliberal socialist society. In this necessarily multi-scalar struggle, movements will need to do a lot of things simultaneously, sort out how to turn local solidarity practices into counter-neoliberal struggles, while building movement-to-movement solidarity across the uneven urban landscapes, and learn how to politicize anti-eviction and other emergency support, which we need to do, while at the same time pushing the state on all scales to protect rather than punish society with austerity politics. At least this is what confronts all solidarity work, whether in Greece or Spain or in Germany with the refugee solidarity work. But it's not for the first time that we are confronted with this dilemma. I mean, there hasn't been a good welfare state in place, a sufficiently good welfare state in place anywhere, but in places like the US, you had people's clinics in the 60s who confronted this dilemma of, do we use our time and our energy to literally save people's lives, as again we do today, or in attacking the state and pushing it to do what it should be doing? It's the same dilemma now faced by the solidarity clinics in Greece, by the work of Medieval in Berlin, because the social welfare state no longer exists and doesn't have any intention to exist. In fact, it is now sponsoring and subsidizing volunteers to band-aid and save people from dying. So they're giving crash courses to do all this better. So this is their trajectory, their plan. So we cannot restrict our activities to only mend the gaps, but at the same time, we have to politicize this activity to always include the fight against this neoliberal state. And I've used up my 45 minutes, and so I will save all the illustrations and examples of local struggles of what this might look like for the discussion. I'm sure you have your own. Thank you.